Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink and coming in right under the wire with a couple more Easter cards. I absolutely had to use this Simon Says stamp, Doodle Egg background stamp. And stay tuned to the end of the video because I will be mentioning a giveaway as well. So for this week's color throwdown challenge, the colors were kind of like a peach and a pink and an orange. So what I decided to do was use some distressed watercolor paper, and I had the smooth side facing up there, and I used my anti-static powder tool. And then this background stamp I just flip over, and then I inked it up with my Simon Says stamp clear embossing ink. And then I just put the paper onto the stamp and then press it really well with my fingers. Now, if I had been using like colored ink or black ink or anything, I would have used a piece of like scratch paper to keep that ink from getting all over my fingers. But a little bit of embossing ink doesn't bother me at all because it doesn't really make a mess. So after I had pressed really, really well, I coated the stamped image with some white embossing powder. And then I'm going to let my heat tool heat up for a good, 30 seconds to a minute. It just helps. The hotter the tool is before you bring it to the paper, the faster you're going to melt that embossing powder and the less you're going to warp your cardstock. However, I am going to warp this a bit because it's a full piece, plus it's watercolor paper. The thicker the cardstock, the more heat you're going to need to melt your embossing powder. But I don't really worry too much about the warping or anything like that because when I adhere this to my actual card in the end, I'm going to use a bunch of foam tape and that's going to flatten it all back out again. So after I've got everything melted and it's all shiny and glossy and all the embossing powder is melted, I'm going to funnel my embossing powder back into the container so that I don't knock that coffee filter over everywhere. It's happened. And then I'm using these 3 distress inks and a little piece of acetate. I've done tons of ink smushing over the years, tons of different videos. The go-to used to be you would smush the inks onto, your craft mat and then you would flip your cardstock over and, press it into there. Really, it's all up to personal preference how you want to play, personal preference how you want to play with this. I wanted to do it this way because this gives me a lot more control, and even though I'm, letting the ink sort of do its own thing, I'm able to use the acetate, and sometimes I'll even use my fingers to move the color around. So I'm just smushing my little mini inks onto this piece of acetate, spraying it a couple times with water, and then bringing it to my embossed background. And because there's so much embossing on this, it really enables the ink to kind of, you can see it's all pooled up here and there. I can move it around. If there was no heat embossing, it would soak in a lot faster. So this gives me even more control that I can kind of move the colors around, let them blend, let them do their thing. Right now it looks like a hot mess. I'm leaving all those little blobs and pools of color because I want those to soak in as this dries, and then I'll have like, darker areas and lighter areas. So it's definitely something you kind of want to play with and experiment with, and you always want to go through to the end and let it dry, because even though it might look like a mess right now, it looks completely different when it's dry. I've done that myself many times and it's like, oh, this is just not working. But a lot of times if I let things dry, walk away from it, come back to it later, it's going to be just fine. So I kept adding ink to this. I'm only using the 3 colors. I'm using Spun Sugar, Tattered Rose, and Dried Marigold. And the one thing I wasn't happy with was the Spun Sugar was very pale. Like the Marigold was really, the orange was really taking over. And the Tattered Rose I liked. I like that kind of lighter peachy sort of a color. But the Spun Sugar was just pale. And I really wanted more color so the eggs would, those embossed eggs would stand out a bit more. So rather than try and layer the Spun Sugar, just because it's just a pale pink, that's what it is, I pulled out some worn lipstick distress ink, which is to me, it's just the deeper color of Spun Sugar. So I used a bit of that, pressed that onto my little acetate sheet, and then you can see it just really intensified the ink. So I'm just using the acetate sheet, the edges of it, to, move the color around, adding a few little splatters, whatever's left on the sheet here. And once I'm happy with where all the color is and whatnot, I'm going to set this aside and let it dry. All those splotches and splatters you can remove if you want, but I like leaving them there. And then after everything's completely dry, you can see how intense that color got. And it's completely dry, so I've die cut it with the largest of the Simon WONKY rectangles die. And then for my sentiment, I'm using the Easter Greetings stamp set. And I have the Happy Easter stamps, and I'm just going to line those up on my little grid mat here and then pick them up with an acrylic block. And then I'm going to stamp these onto some Gina K Sweet Mango cardstock. So I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool again, stamp those sentiments with that same clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to use that same white embossing powder to heat emboss this sentiment. So after I've got it stamped, I can just coat it with that embossing powder over that exact same coffee filter. I just keep reusing the same one over and over again. And then they're biodegradable, which is nice too, just little something extra. So I got everything coated, got my heat tool heated up so I can melt the heat embossing powder. And then after that, I'm going to use my little Swiffer cloth to remove that excess anti-static powder off of that orange cardstock. And then I can trim this down with my paper trimmer. So after I've got this trimmed out the way I want with my paper trimmer, I'm going to use my little detail cutting scissors to cut a little flag in the one end. So I just cut a notch down the center, and then I cut each corner. I cannot talk today. I cut each corner matching up to the end of that little notch. So it just creates that nice little flag end. And then as an additional little embellishment, I had to use this bunny from that same Easter greeting set because he's so cute. So I grabbed another piece of the distressed watercolor paper and have the smooth side facing up again. And I'm going to stamp the bunny with Simon's Smoke ink. So just a nice gray. I decided to go with gray rather than black, just a little bit of a softer look. And then I grabbed that same little piece of acetate and I just smushed my ink pads again onto it, but rather than smush them onto the bunny, I'm just going to pick up the color with my detail water brush and just really lightly add a bit of color to him so he's not just plain. So I used the Tattered Rose for the bunny himself. I was thinking of like, you know, a nearly white bunny, so, you know, with a little bit of that kind of peachy sort of color. So painted that on really, really lightly, and then added that spun sugar again to his ears and nose, and again thought it was a little bit too pale. So I'm going to add a little bit of that worn lipstick again to intensify it. Just, again, very, very simple. Small little image, water brush, distress inks, can't go wrong. So added that little bit of worn lipstick to kind of intensify it, and then once it was dry, I just quickly fussy cut them out with my scissors. And then for my card base, I'd actually used the Love and Friendship stamp set and just took a couple sentiments from it and heat embossed it on that same Sweet Mango cardstock. So I'd heat emboss it with a white emboss powder, trim them out with my scissors. And then I stamped the bunny again onto the inside of my card with that same smoke ink. And then I just took the color again with my water brush and what I had already smushed on that acetate sheet and just very lightly added that color just to give him that little extra something. So try not to add too much water because you don't want the cardstock to pill, but doing light amounts of coloring like this, it's not gonna hurt the cardstock or anything or make a mess. So after I've got my little bunnies, got a little bit of color and definition, I'm going to adhere those two stamped and embossed sentiments right below him. And then to adhere my background to my card, like I said, I'm going to use some foam tape here. So I have Simon's Big Mama foam tape roll, and I'm going to cover the entire back of this with this foam tape. So once I've got all of this on there, I'm going to peel off all of the backing, and then I can adhere this into place. So after all the watercoloring and then running it through my die cut machine, that pretty much flattened it out, and then the foam tape finishes the job. So this is nice and flat and not warped or anything. So I've got that adhered, and then I adhered the sentiment as well as the bunny with some more foam tape, so it's popped up there. And then for my final bit of embellishment, I have some Studio Caudia Snow Crystals. So I'm just going to adhere these into place with little dabs of multi-medium matte adhesive. And I'm just going to pick up the crystals with my little jewel picker and just press those into place just as a little something. No sparkle, shockingly. Just fun. I wanted the color to stand out more than anything, and I didn't want to take away from this, like all the pattern and the detail of the background. So after I made the first card, I couldn't resist making a second card because, you know, ideas were starting to roll. So for my second card, I did the same thing. I heat embossed that background onto some distressed watercolor paper with white embossing powder. But this time, rather than smushing the inks, I'm using the same 3 distress inks. And rather than smushing them, I'm using the new Waves and Hills stencil from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm picking up the color with a mini ink blending tool and sponging the color over the stencil onto the background. So I've got that wave pattern as well as the background, and all of that heat embossing is going to resist all of that ink. So I wasn't even sure how well this would work, because I was like, it might be a little too busy, it might look a little weird. But again, since I'd started, I went all the way to the end and finished the whole card front. So I just kept alternating the colors and moving the stencil around. So I was using like different parts of this, you know, wave stencil, and I would just alternate each color. So I'd go pink, orange, this tattered rose, which is my like ode to the peach of the color throwdown challenge, and went all the way until I got to the very top. And on the areas where the color would lighten and turn almost white there towards the next color, I would just take that color again and blend it back onto the cardstock so that it was more solid color, because again, I want all of that detail of the eggs and everything to show. So after I've got this entire background completely sponged in and filled in with all of the color, I'm going to use that same wonky rectangle stencil wafer die to die cut this, just because I like the size of it, and two, I like it. It gives it that fun little stitching detail around the edges. So I'm going to run this through my machine, die cut it with that fun wonky rectangle. And then I also die cut a couple of bunnies with the new Topside bunny die. So I die cut 2 of them, again, from that same piece of distress watercolor cardstock. And then I picked up a little bit more of that tattered rose ink again, and just added it very, very lightly onto the edges of the bunny and the edges of the ears and the one little tail, just to give it that little bit of definition so they're not just stark white. So after I've got that all colored, I end up, I used sentiments from, this is an older stamp set from Simon, the Some Bunny stamp set. And for the bunny on the front of the card, I flipped him over and I used just a little bit of washi tape to hold the eyes into place, because I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I didn't feel like die cutting them from a different color cardstock. I kind of thought about adding googly eyes because it'd be really cute, but held the eyes in place with washi tape. And then I added 2 really thin strips of that Simon foam adhesive just below the ears. And then I pressed on 2 full-size pieces of foam tape so that when I flip this over, those are going to push out the ears a little bit, so you can see there, and it gives it that tiny little extra bit of definition. So after I'd done that, I'm going to peel off the backing off the foam tape, and then I can adhere this bunny into place on my background. And I did the same thing with that sentiment that I'd stamped and embossed onto some pink cardstock. And I should have done this step with his tail at the end, because I've had to fiddle with this and like basically re-adhere it more than once, because I, didn't let it dry and put on foam tape and etc. So I would do this at the end, but I added a little pom-pom to his tail because of course I had to. There's something about little bunny tails and on cards, and doing that with pom-poms just makes my day. So I did that, and then I actually added a little nose with one of the Studio Claudia Cupid's Kiss crystals that came in one of the previous Simon Says monthly card kits. So I had a little pink crystal to his nose, and then for the inside of the card, I have my second bunny, as well as more sentiments from that Some Bunny stamp set that I had heat embossed. So the second bunny I just adhered flat, and then I adhered one of the little die cut tails to him because I wanted to keep things really flat since it's the inside of the card. And then I'm going to adhere those sentiments right below him. And then just to give that little bit of definition to the eyes, I just used a black glaze pen. If I was to redo this, honestly, I would just have die cut a scrap of black cardstock and inlaid those like I've done with tons of other dies when I use them from Simon, all those fun little picture book characters. But I used a glaze pen and it was fine in the end. But again, if I was to redo it, I would just die cut it and it would just look a little bit cleaner, I think. So I did that, and then I adhered my sponged card front onto my card with more foam tape. And then for this bunny, I'm going to add some black Nouveau crystal drops, just very lightly, to his eyes, just to fill that area in so it's nice and glossy, and it'll be just a little bit raised. So I was trying to be really careful to make sure they're perfectly round. And then I'm going to add a few more of those snow crystals to my background, and that's going to finish off my card. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is going to be a giveaway. It's going to be over on my blog. I have the stamp sets I used and the wafer die set and whatnot, so you can check that out on my blog. There will be a link to that directly below the video in the description box below, so you can check it out if you're interested, as well as all of the supplies used, the pictures, etc. All that's going to be over on my blog, so you can check that out below. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!